Breaking news out of Washington, and what just unfolded in the past 24 hours represents what may be the most consequential shift in the political landscape since the 2024 election. Senator Adam Schiff, the vice chair of the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee, has just revealed that the 2026 Senate map, which political analysts across the spectrum had written off as unwinnable for Democrats just months ago, has now transformed into what he calls a clear and viable path to flipping the Senate. And the combination of extraordinary recruitment successes, strategic retirements by vulnerable Republicans, and grassroots energy in states from Alaska to North Carolina means that President Trump, who depends on Senate control to advance his agenda and protect his administration from oversight, is now facing the prospect of a divided Congress that could fundamentally constrain his power for the final 2 years of his term. The implications of this political earthquake are reverberating through campaign headquarters, congressional offices, and the West Wing itself. In the next 20 minutes, I'm going to break down exactly how Democrats went from what looked like an insurmountable disadvantage to genuine competitive opportunities in multiple battleground states. Reveal which specific candidates and recruitment decisions have shifted the playing field. Explain why Republican retirements in key states have created unexpected openings, and show you why political strategists in both parties are now saying that control of the Senate in 2026 is genuinely up for grabs. We'll examine what this means for Trump's ability to govern, the stakes for American democracy heading into the 2028 presidential election, and why the administration's own policies over the past year may have created the conditions for this dramatic reversal. The question everyone in political circles is asking tonight: how did a Senate map that seemed locked for Republicans suddenly become one of the most competitive midterm battlefields in modern history? And what does it mean for the balance of power in Washington? Let's begin with where things stood just a year ago, because the contrast with today's reality is absolutely striking. In early 2025, if you had asked any credible political analyst about the 2026 Senate elections, you would have received essentially the same answer from both Democratic and Republican strategists. The map was brutal for Democrats. They were defending seats in competitive states while Republicans held advantages in states that had trended increasingly red. The consensus was that while Democrats had a reasonable chance of flipping the House of Representatives, the Senate was likely to remain in Republican hands, potentially even expanding their majority. That assessment wasn't partisan spin. It was based on hard electoral math. The seats up for election in 2026 included several Democrats defending in states that Trump had won, while Republicans were defending seats in states where they had structural advantages. The conventional wisdom was that Democrats would need everything to break their way just to maintain their current position, let alone gain ground. But Senator Adam Schiff, speaking in his capacity as vice chair of the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee, has just painted a dramatically different picture. And the details he provided suggest this isn't wishful thinking or political messaging. This is a genuine transformation driven by specific developments that have fundamentally altered the strategic landscape. Let's walk through exactly what changed and why it matters. First, the recruitment successes. In politics, candidate quality matters enormously. A well-known, well-liked candidate with a track record of winning elections can compete in states where a generic candidate from their party would struggle. And Democrats have apparently succeeded in recruiting exactly those kinds of candidates in several critical battleground states. Start with Ohio. This is a state that has trended Republican in recent presidential elections. Trump won Ohio comfortably in both 2020 and 2024. By conventional wisdom, this should be difficult territory for Democrats. But Senator Sherrod Brown, who had been considering a run for governor, has decided instead to run for re-election to the Senate. Why does this matter? Because Sherrod Brown has a proven track record of winning in Ohio. Even when his party loses the state at the presidential level, he runs ahead of the top of the ticket. He connects with working-class voters in ways that many national Democrats struggle to do. And crucially, he's facing an opponent who was appointed to the Senate rather than elected. someone who doesn't have the same name recognition or electoral experience that Brown possesses. According to Senator Schiff, polling in Ohio now shows the race essentially tied. In a state that Trump won decisively, Democrats have a genuinely competitive Senate race. That's not supposed to be possible in a midterm map that was considered favorable to Republicans. Now move to North Carolina. This is another state with similar dynamics. It leans Republican in presidential elections, but has shown itself willing to elect Democrats in statewide races when the right candidate emerges. And Democrats just landed perhaps their strongest possible recruit, Governor Roy Cooper. Cooper is term limited as governor and could have retired from politics. Instead, according to Schiff, he made what Schiff describes as a patriotic decision to step up and run for Senate. Cooper is popular in North Carolina. He's won statewide elections there multiple times. He has the kind of cross-partisan appeal that's essential in a competitive state, and he's running for an open seat. Republican Senator Tom Tillis decided to retire rather than seek re-election. According to Schiff, the cuts to Medicaid and the Affordable Care Act, signature policies of the Trump administration, pushed Tillis to the point where he chose to leave the Senate rather than defend those positions to voters. Think about what that means. A Republican incumbent in a state Republicans need to hold decided the political environment was difficult enough that retirement was preferable to running for re-election. That's a warning sign for the party. And Democrats have responded by recruiting their strongest possible candidate to compete for that open seat. Senator Schiff stated explicitly that he feels very good about winning in North Carolina. That's not hedge language. That's a senior Democratic strategist saying he believes Democrats will flip a Republican-held seat in a state Trump won. Then there's Maine. Senator Susan Collins has been one of the most successful Republican politicians in New England, winning re-election multiple times in a state that votes Democratic at the presidential level. She's been considered nearly unbeatable, but this cycle is different. Democrats have recruited multiple strong candidates for the primary, including the current governor of Maine, Janet Mills. Having a sitting governor with high approval ratings willing to challenge an entrenched incumbent signals that internal Democratic polling and strategic assessment suggest Collins is more vulnerable than she's been in previous cycles. Senator Schiff described the primary field as including both Governor Mills and another candidate, Graham Plattner, who is popular among grassroots activists. That suggests a competitive primary that will ultimately produce a battle-tested nominee ready for the general election. And Schiff stated that Maine is very much in contention. Again, this is a seat Democrats haven't been competitive for in recent cycles. Now, it's on the board as a genuine opportunity. And then comes perhaps the most surprising development, Alaska. This is a state that has been reliably Republican in federal elections for decades. It's not a state where Democrats typically invest significant resources, but Congresswoman Mary Pella, who represents Alaska in the House, has just announced she's running for Senate. Why is this significant? Because Palola is, according to Senator Schiff, probably the most popular politician in Alaska. She's proven she can win in a state with a Republican lean by building a coalition that crosses partisan lines. She connects with Alaska voters in ways that transcend typical partisan divisions, and the numbers Schiff cited are remarkable. He stated that simply by entering the race, Pella is either tied with the Republican incumbent or even leading by a point or two. In Alaska, a Democrat tied or leading in Alaska for a Senate seat. Let's pause and consider what this means collectively. Democrats now have genuinely competitive races in Ohio, North Carolina, Maine, and Alaska. If they were to win all four of those states, they would flip the Senate. They would take control of the chamber away from Republicans. Senator Schiff acknowledged that would require winning all four, which is a tall order. But the point is that there is now a clear path. A year ago, strategists couldn't even sketch out a plausible scenario for Democrats to win the Senate. Now there are multiple states where the combination of strong Democratic candidates and either vulnerable Republican incumbents or open seats created by Republican retirements has made the races competitive. And Schiff noted that the map continues to expand beyond those four core battleground states. He mentioned Texas, Iowa, and Florida as additional states that may come into contention depending on how the national political environment develops and whether Democrats can recruit strong candidates there as well. This is not how political strategists talk when they're trying to spin a bad situation into something positive for fundraising purposes. This is how they talk when they genuinely believe the landscape has shifted in their favor. So, what happened? What changed between a year ago when the map looked impossible and today when senior Democratic strategists are talking about a clear path to flipping the Senate? Several factors converge to explain this shift, and they're worth understanding because they reveal deeper dynamics about American politics heading into this crucial midterm election. First, candidate recruitment matters enormously, and Democrats have apparently done the work necessary to persuade high-quality candidates to run, convincing Sherrod Brown to run for Senate instead of governor in Ohio, persuading Roy Cooper to continue in public service rather than retire in North Carolina, getting Mary Pella to make the leap from House to Senate in Alaska. These are significant accomplishments that required sustained effort by party leadership. Senator Schiff explained the philosophy behind this approach. He said, Democrats need to expand the field by recruiting the strongest possible candidates everywhere in the country, even in states they've been losing. They need to start competing and winning again, particularly in the South and the West. And the way you do that is by finding candidates who can connect with voters in those states who have proven track records of winning elections, who aren't generic national figures, but rather individuals with deep roots in their communities. Second, the administration's own policies have created political vulnerabilities for Republicans defending these seats. Senator Schiff specifically mentioned cuts to Medicaid and the Affordable Care Act as factors that contributed to Senator Tillis's decision to retire in North Carolina. When even Republican incumbents are uncomfortable defending the administration's policies, that's a sign those policies may be politically toxic. And there are broader concerns beyond health care. Schiff painted a picture of an administration that has engaged in what he called unprecedented abuses of power over the past year. He described censorship of the press, with major media companies like ABC and CBS facing pressure and changing their coverage to avoid administration retaliation. He mentioned weaponization of the Justice Department. He referenced what he called the militarization of American streets and tragedies, like an incident in Minnesota that he suggested resulted from administration policies. Whether voters agree with Schiff's characterization or not, the fact that Democrats plan to campaign aggressively on these issues means Republicans will have to defend the administration's record. And in competitive states, that defense may be difficult, particularly if voters are experiencing economic anxiety or concerns about the direction of the country. Third, there's the Trump factor itself. In midterm elections, the president's party typically faces headwinds. Voters often use midterms as an opportunity to express dissatisfaction with whoever holds the White House. Trump won't be on the ballot in 2026, but his administration's performance will be. And if voters in swing states are unhappy with inflation, economic conditions, foreign policy, or domestic issues, they may take that frustration out on Republican Senate candidates. Senator Schiff noted that Sherrod Brown typically runs ahead of the top of the ticket in Ohio. With Trump not on the ballot in 2026, that removes what had been a Republican advantage. Voters who might have split their ticket voting for Trump for president but Brown for Senate now just have the Senate race to focus on. And Brown's proven ability to win over working-class voters who might otherwise vote Republican gives Democrats a genuine opportunity in a state that has trended red at the presidential level. Fourth, money follows competitive races. Schiff made this point explicitly. When candidates demonstrate they can be competitive, when early polling shows races tightening, when there's genuine belief that a seat can flip, resources flow to those campaigns both from party committees and from grassroots donors who see an opportunity to make a difference. Schiff described seeing this pattern repeatedly. A state that initially looks like a long shot gets a strong candidate. That candidate gains traction. Suddenly the national party is investing. Grassroots donors are contributing, and what looked like an impossible race becomes genuinely competitive. He expressed confidence that wherever Democrats can demonstrate competitiveness in 2026, the resources will be there to compete effectively. And he specifically praised grassroots donors for being energized and willing to support candidates across the country. Now let's talk about what this means for governance and for the stakes of this election, because Senator Schiff was remarkably candid about why Democratic control of at least one chamber of Congress matters so profoundly. He framed the 2026 midterms as an opportunity to put checks on what he described as an administration that has abused power in ways that exceed even the first Trump term, with the exception of the January 6th insurrection. He argued that without congressional oversight, without the ability to block problematic nominees, without a check on executive power, the country faces 3 more years without guardrails. Let's be specific about what that means in practice. If Democrats control the Senate, they control committee chairmanships. That means they control what gets investigated, what witnesses get called, what subpoenas get issued. They can conduct oversight of executive branch agencies. They can investigate allegations of misconduct or abuse of power. They can bring transparency to actions that might otherwise remain hidden. Control of the Senate also means control over confirmations. Every federal judge requires Senate confirmation. Every cabinet member requires Senate confirmation. Every senior Justice Department official requires Senate confirmation. If Democrats control the Senate, they can block nominees they consider unqualified or dangerous. They can demand concessions in exchange for confirmations. They have leverage that minority parties simply don't possess. And then there's legislation. While the House initiates spending bills, the Senate must pass them as well. A Democratic Senate could block legislation it considers harmful. It could demand modifications to bills as the price of passage. It could pursue its own legislative priorities and force the House and the administration to negotiate. Senator Schiff also raised a point that deserves serious attention: the 2028 presidential election. He noted that in the previous Trump term, when Democrats took control of the House in the 2018 midterms, that provided a crucial check on executive power. He suggested that without similar constraints following the 2026 midterms, there are serious questions about what the administration might do leading up to and during the 2028 election. He pointed to the fact that in Senate Judiciary Committee hearings, nominees cannot get confirmed if they acknowledge that Joe Biden legitimately won the 22-20 election. That's not hyperbole. Schiff stated explicitly that you cannot get confirmed for a position in this administration if you say Trump lost in 2020. Think about what that means for institutional integrity. The administration is requiring loyalty to a false narrative about election fraud as a condition of employment in the Justice Department and federal agencies throughout the executive branch. And Schiff raised the concern that this creates conditions where election interference or refusal to certify legitimate election results in 2028 becomes a genuine possibility. He noted that they tried it once on January 6th. Since then, they've spent years rewriting the history of what happened, normalizing the idea that elections can be contested based on claims of fraud, and installing loyalists throughout government who have demonstrated they won't stand up to presidential pressure. If Democrats control the Senate after 2026, they have tools to prevent or at least constrain some of those scenarios. If Republicans maintain control with a party that Schiff described as even more supine and unwilling to stand up to Trump than they were in the first term, the possibilities become more alarming. Schiff contrasted the current Republican caucus with the 2017-2018 version. He pointed out that in the first term, when Trump talked about firing special counsel Robert Mueller, Senate Republicans spoke up and warned him not to do it. There was at least some willingness to establish red lines. Schiff asked rhetorically whether anyone believes current Senate Republicans would stand up to Trump in a similar situation. His clear implication is that they wouldn't. He also noted that congressional Republicans have been systematically surrendering their constitutional powers. He cited the war power, the power to declare or refuse to declare war, which he said Congress effectively surrendered just this week. He mentioned the power of the purse, Congress's constitutional authority to control federal spending, which he argued Republicans have allowed the president to ignore through empowerment and rescission of appropriated funds. These are not small matters of partisan disagreement. These are fundamental questions about the separation of powers, about whether the legislative branch will function as a co-equal branch of government or will simply defer to executive authority. Now let's address the political and strategic challenges Democrats face even with this improved map. Senator Schiff was candid about the need to remain focused on the issues voters care most about. He emphasized affordability, the cost of housing, the cost of groceries, the reality that millions of Americans are working harder than ever but struggling more than ever. He argued that economic anxiety has to remain the central focus of Democratic campaigns, but he also acknowledged that Republicans will try to change the subject. They'll introduce social and cultural wedge issues designed to distract from economic concerns and force Democrats to talk about topics that may be less favorable politically. Schiff's advice was that Democrats need to address those attacks and rebut them, but always bring the conversation back to affordability and economic opportunity. He made an interesting connection between economic issues and democracy issues. He argued that the reason democracy is under threat is fundamentally because the economy hasn't been working for millions of people. When people see their quality of life declining, when they see their parents had better economic opportunities than they do, they become willing to support demagogues who promise simple solutions. Therefore, defending democracy requires fixing the economic foundations that have been eroding for working families. This is a sophisticated political argument, and it suggests Democrats are thinking carefully about how to message both economic concerns and threats to democratic institutions in ways that resonate with voters beyond the party's base. Senator Schiff also pointed to recent special elections as evidence that the political environment may be shifting in Democrats' favor. He described November's special elections as an extraordinary sweep for Democrats, with the party not just turning out its base, but actually persuading voters who had previously voted Republican to switch sides. That's a critical distinction. Turnout is important, but persuasion is what creates genuine electoral realignment. If Democrats are winning special elections by converting previous Republican voters, not just by maximizing Democratic turnout, that suggests the political environment is more favorable than top-line polling might indicate. Special elections have historically been leading indicators of midterm performance. When a party does better than expected in special elections leading up to a midterm, it often signals momentum that shows up in the general election. Let's also consider the stakes from a purely institutional perspective, separate from partisan considerations. The United States Senate is designed to be a check on both the executive branch and the House of Representatives. It's meant to provide stability, to require broader consensus for major actions to prevent any single faction from exercising unconstrained power. When one party controls the presidency, the House and the Senate, that check diminishes significantly. The administration can advance its agenda with minimal compromise. Oversight becomes difficult, because the party in power has little incentive to investigate itself. Nominees get confirmed even if significant concerns exist about their qualifications or judgment. A divided Congress where one party controls the House and another controls the Senate, or where the Senate is controlled by the party that doesn't hold the White House, restores some of that balance. It forces negotiation. It creates pressure for compromise. It means that extreme positions are less likely to become law because they can't command sufficient support across different constituencies. Whether you support or oppose the current administration's policies, there's an argument that divided government produces better outcomes by preventing either party from pursuing its agenda without any meaningful constraint. The question is whether American voters will see the 2026 midterms through that lens or through a more purely partisan framework. And the answer may differ across the various competitive states Democrats are now targeting. Here's what we know with certainty at this moment. The 2026 Senate map has transformed from what looked like a Republican advantage into a genuinely competitive battlefield with multiple plausible paths for Democrats to gain seats or even flip control of the chamber. That transformation is driven by successful candidate recruitment, strategic retirements by Republican incumbents who appear uncomfortable defending the administration's record, and a political environment that may be more favorable to the opposition party than typical midterm dynamics would suggest. The consequences of this shift extend beyond just the 2026 elections themselves. Control of the Senate for the final 2 years of Trump's term would determine whether meaningful oversight occurs, whether problematic nominees can be blocked, whether legislation requires genuine bipartisan negotiation, and it would shape the institutional landscape heading into the 2028 presidential election, including the critical question of whether Congress would certify election results if the administration contests them. For President Trump, this represents the nightmare scenario he most feared: an energized opposition party with credible candidates, competitive races in multiple states, and the prospect of losing the Senate majority that has protected his administration from accountability. The combination of policy unpopularity in key states, strong Democratic recruits, and Republican retirements has created exactly the conditions that could lead to a fundamental shift in the balance of power. For Democrats, this represents an opportunity that seemed impossible just months ago. The challenge now is executing effectively, maintaining focus on the issues voters care about while making the case for why congressional oversight and checks on executive power matter. The margin for error is minimal, and much will depend on how effectively campaigns are run in these competitive states over the next several months. And for American voters across the political spectrum, this election will determine not just which party controls the Senate, but what kind of governance framework exists for a crucial period in American history. The stakes could not be higher. This story is still developing, and the political landscape will continue to evolve as we move closer to the 2026 elections. Stay with us for ongoing analysis and coverage of these critical Senate races. If you want to understand the forces shaping American politics and what's at stake in these elections, make sure you're following our coverage. These aren't just partisan battles. These are defining moments for American governance and democracy. Subscribe to stay informed as this crucial midterm election unfolds. And join the conversation about what kind of political system we want and what kind of government we're willing to accept. The decisions made by voters in Ohio, North Carolina, Maine, Alaska, and potentially other competitive states will echo for years to come, and every citizen has a stake in understanding what's at risk and what's possible.